the internet on a daily basis, and chances are you do. You probably don't put much thought into cybersecurity. You know, your network connections, the pages you visit, the files you download. You should be thinking about these all the time. Welcome to And Security for All. Your host is Kim Hakem. We're here to help you understand, in general terms, how and why your cybersecurity should be kept in check. Now, here is Kim Hakem.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. It's a wonderful Friday. It's nice and hot outside where I'm at. I hope everyone else is not getting this heat. But welcome to And Security for All. Today, I've got a great guest. He's a good friend of mine, and we've spoken a lot about some of the topics we're going to be covering today. So I hope everyone enjoys the show. I asked about any future events first thing, and they said that they were the next event is August 23rd. So I think the whole crew is going to get a few weeks of well-deserved rest to kind of recoup. They had a really great event yesterday in Tampa, and the next event's coming in at the end of August. So I think they've got a few weeks to rest and to really get ready for the next event. This is my second time in 2 weeks, so I'm really excited to be here. I'm joined today by Tom Vincent. He is like I said, a friend of mine. We've worked together for many years, and the things that we're going to talk about today is around the new regulations, the new compliance requirements of privacy, and specifically transparency, and how transparency and some of the new requirements can actually conflict, and what that means for organizations, and how do the organizations really deal with that particular situation. So I invite everybody to jump online if you're watching this on LinkedIn, to throw questions into the chat so we can get those in front of Tom and really pick his brain on some of this stuff. So welcome, Tom. I really appreciate you coming on and joining us today.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm sorry for that Peter Brady moment there just for a second. No, I appreciate being here. It's always fun to talk. I think that, generally just to warn the audience, the biggest challenge for us is to stay on topic, but hopefully we'll be able to do that today.
Stay on topic and stay under time. That's our biggest thing.
That's right.
We've spoken many days right into the night. So, well, first of all, tell us about yourself. So tell us, kind of who you are, what you do, and kind of give the audience a good background on yourself.
Sure. I am one of the cybersecurity practice group leads at GableGotwals. For those of you not familiar with GableGotwals, we're a general practice firm based in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We've got just over 100 lawyers. We're in several different states. My part of it deals with cybersecurity and data privacy. My background is primarily on the compliance side of things. Spent 15 years in financial institutions doing serving various compliance roles, including anti-money laundering, security, privacy, and corporate governance. So what I do primarily is work with clients to make sure that things don't happen. I am what's referred to as a transactional attorney. I'm not a litigator. I don't try to win a fight. I try to avoid it. And so a lot of what Jonathan and I have talked about over the years is how to keep bad things from happening. In addition to that, I also chair Gable's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. I do some other work in that space with other organizations as well. And I guess really, Jonathan, the main thing I'd want to say is, as I mentioned before, and as you hinted at, Jonathan and I have dealt with these issues and talked about these issues for many years. And I'd encourage you, if you have any questions, to throw them in the chat. Let us know, because one thing we found is, even though we work in the same space, our perspectives are much different because we're both working different sides of the issue. So please feel free to ask, because I think both of us may have an answer for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, being on the CISO side, I'm right there with you. You try to prevent things, and you try to do whatever you can to make sure that things don't happen. And that's kind of actually how we got together all those years ago, is working on Grambley's Blithely, and a few other things that kind of came out in that same time frame, and we started working together to work through the problems of understanding it, implementing it, maintaining it, understanding it, all those things. And that's really what I wanted to bring you on for, because I really, number one, I respect the things that you have done. You're extremely knowledgeable about this stuff. And we always have a good time on this, even though it may be boring. A lot of people kind of roll their eyes when we talk about compliance and privacy, but I really enjoy this stuff. I know you really enjoy this stuff, so I think it'll be a lot of fun. So again, thank you for coming on. I think the crowd's going to like it.
Oh, absolutely. And a couple of one housekeeping thing, and then just another, I think, kickoff point. Standard disclaimer: the views expressed today are mine and do not necessarily represent the views of GableGotwals. But as a kickoff point, I wanted to talk about one of the words in the title of this program today, which Jonathan and I have dealt with a lot. It's the word expectations. When we talk about information, when we talk about security, when we talk about privacy, as Jonathan said, it can kind of get a little dry. But if you bring it back to this idea of well, what do you expect? That's where a number of the issues that we're going to be talking about can get resolved, or can just be made worse. Is what are the expectations of the people who are involved in the transaction, in the arrangement, in the agreement? What are my expectations, for example, when I give an online retailer my credit card information? What are the government's expectations when they're asking that retailer or another company for information that may include my information? And so I'd encourage you, as you are listening today, to think about not just what we may say in terms of sort of the dry technical piece, but just in your own life, in your own world. What are your expectations when you give information to someone? And what are other parties' expectations with respect to your information?
Now, Tom, do you think over the last, let's say, 7 years, but even as far back as maybe 10 to 15, you start looking at some of the things that were changing back with the data privacy directive and the kind of the mindset of the new age of cybersecurity, information contained. But do you think those expectations have been changing, from what it was 25 years ago to what it was 20 years ago to 15 to 10 to now? Do you think that that's evolving?
I think so. And honestly, Jonathan, I'd say I'd go back even further than that. I'd say, because I remember in the early 2000s when the USA Patriot Act was adopted and the regulations hit the banking industry with respect to information collection on customers. And at that time, there was a big push to get a lot of this information. There really wasn't as much of a push on what you did with it once you got it. It was, well, we're going to collect all of this information and we've got to be able to use it, getting to that argument or that idea of transparency that you were talking about, is whatever you get the information and you use it. In many instances, you're sharing it with the government for identity verification purposes, for anti-money laundering efforts, things like that. But then go forward some years from that, and then that pendulum started to swing and swung really far on the other side towards the security approach, which was not sharing the information, not using it, but you got it and you secured it. And
Right.
The default was you don't share it. The default was you don't use it unless you absolutely have to. And now I think you're seeing that start to swing back as there are more and more capabilities to use that information. When people have seen what can be done with that, certainly from a monetized standpoint, when you're looking at some of your data aggregators, but now with some of the things that the government is doing in terms of stepping up efforts to require the collection of more and more information about individuals and companies, realizing the power that is in that information.
Well, yeah, and I was going to ask you about that, because I mean, I remember back way too many years ago when I was in college, the term big data was really coming to its own, where people were learning how to do it and they were understanding what that meant. And I think that from a security perspective, because at that time there wasn't this idea of cybersecurity, at least in most organizations, and there certainly wasn't this idea of privacy in the organizations, but there was this idea of there is value in data, and you start thinking about all of the the membership programs and the shoppers memberships programs, a little key ring things where you badge it so they could honestly so they could track what you were buying, and all these other things. That became a huge market to be able to understand what the customers were doing, what the market was doing. So there was a big push to that. Again, I mean, that was I'm going to say a lot of years ago. I don't want to say how old I am, but it was a lot of years ago. But that became a big deal. And looking back now, I could see the writing on the wall of the collection of all that data is great for certain things, but there's also a lot of risk to that because you're capturing a lot of PII, a lot of sensitive PII, if we're going to use the GDPR term, a lot of things that could turn around and be used to hurt people and to harm people. And when we think about compliances, that was also the same time frame, in that same general time frame of things like HIPAA coming around and the beginnings of GLBA. And a lot of these things started as like, hey, yeah, we do need to protect data. We need to be able to use it, be able to manage it. We need to move it, but we also need to protect it. So, I think that this is where we're at right now has really started. I mean, what do you think? 25, 30 years ago, kind of that buildup of that snowball of spinning, not necessarily out of control, but at a fair growing pace.
I think so. Just to go back to the passage of the USA Patriot Act and the regulations implementing it, I can tell you, having worked in banking at the time, the approach of the regulators and therefore by extension bankers was generally get as much information as you could about your client. And you had that both from a government requirement standpoint for customer identity verification, but you also had it. Keep in mind that for years banks have been in the business of knowing what their customers are about to be able to better serve them, whether that is a commercial lending customer or a customer on the in the wealth management or trust administration components of an organization. And so just let's take that as our starting point for purposes of the discussion. You have a big push to collect a lot of information. The default was not don't get it unless you need it. It was get it in case you need it.
Right.
And so then when we got all of this information, then because it was essentially sitting around and you had, you started to see some data breaches come across. You started to see, if you look at, and I know you're familiar with this as I am, if you look at a lot of the state data breach statutes that were passed, Oklahoma's was passed in 2008. A lot of those data breach statutes were premised on particular pieces of information, still continue to be premised on particular pieces of information.
Yep.
And many of them have not been updated since that time. So we're still, let's say going from collection of a great deal of information to putting these reporting requirements in place at the state level for residents if particular pieces of information are compromised. But while some of the data breach statutes require reporting only if there is a risk of harm, you couple that with the litigation of a data breach where the actual value, the immediate value, shall we say, of information is litigated, and it's often very difficult for that actual harm to be proven because of the what's the word I'm looking for? Because of the lack of perhaps an immediate value of that information because the access value of that information is not recognized. And what I mean by that is you get, if you get my name and my social security number, does that have any absolute value on its own? I would argue that it does, but is there a dollar value that I would that costs me if it gets out? Not necessarily.
Right.
There's not any immediate financial damage, but that gives someone access to, for example, opening up a credit card, opening up a bank account, doing something like that. In which case, then that activity may cause me damage, may result in some damage to my person, my character, my finances because of some debt that is racked up. But
Yep.
it's a sort of damage that isn't necessarily recognized by the court system, and as a result by businesses that are necessarily looking at how this information should be protected, because they're looking at the pieces of data going back to 2003, I think it was, when the regulations were implemented for USA Patriot. You're looking at this discrete set of data elements, as opposed to, well, what is it that I can do with this?
Right. Well, okay, let me ask you, because when we think about the harm issue, does the release of this information actually cause harm to an individual? Do you think that that's changing? Because, when you look at GDPR specifically, and this idea that it doesn't necessarily, what is the limitation on that? I understand that could it cause harm? I know what that means, but I also, from a cybersecurity perspective, know what I can do with that information as it relates to an attack. We kind of talked about that last week on the show, where we were attacking families, and you start with some of the information and you kind of gather it together. So I can demonstrate the harm, and I can do it almost live, with an understanding that, depending on what the audience is. So do you think that with GDPR and this idea of the private right to action, or with the changes in the cybersecurity mindset of how we can use that data, and how we're seeing it being used in the attacks out in the world, do you think that that's changing, or do you think that will change from a court's perspective?
I think it is changing, but one of the things that, at least, and again, this is just my opinion on this, I think that the way it's changing is not from a determination of the value or the amount of the harm. It's the assignment of a value to that. GDPR has,
Yep.
there is a fine that is assigned to that.
Yeah.
Just like for example, HIPAA is a good example of this as well. If you look at the damages or the penalties that are typically assigned to covered entities or business associates under HIPAA, the issue isn't what was the harm to the patients whose information was released. It is more a fixed value or an assigned value applied to the controls that were or were not in place. It's not,
Right.
we're going to fine you. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some additional penalties that may be levied with respect to damages to the individuals. But if you look at the way that penalty structure typically works, it's an arbitrary amount that's assigned. It's not a determination of the damage. It's like, we know this is valuable and this is the value that we've assigned to it, but we don't really have a way to quantify that as a result of this breach.
Yep.
And so therefore, we're going to tell you that, well, because you didn't do this, here is the value of what you didn't do, essentially.
Right. Now that is separate from the punitive. When you're talking about punitive damages by a data protection authority or someone to say, hey, you didn't protect this, regardless of any value to the data subject, there is the fact that you didn't protect this, here is a fine, that 2% or 4%. So do you think that is changing things? Because it's, again, you're not to get onto a GDPR show on this, but those numbers at 2% for that's huge for some organizations. And then you have that whole, in some cases for privacy laws, is that private right of action. So do you think that could be changing people's mindsets? And I know this is not really the topic that we're talking about, it's kind of a tangent, but what do you think about that?
I think that is changing some people's minds. I think that the difficulty is, as you and I have seen for years, is getting people to understand how these things apply to them. And the word that comes to mind is rationally, because often when
Right.
people think about this, they think, oh, well, that's a law in another country that doesn't apply to me here. They're not going to pay attention to me. Well, as we've seen in many of these things, they're not going to pay attention to you until they do.
Right.
It's one of those things where, just like there are a lot of people that cheat on their taxes, and it's not like there is necessarily a scanner that the government has to go and scan everyone's tax returns and see who in fact is cheating on their taxes. But if they look at your return and you happen to have cheated on your taxes, then they're going to figure it out.
Sure, absolutely.
So I think that and one of the things I wanted to get back to when we were talking about this the issue of damages, and something you'd mentioned about what as a cybersecurity person, what you can do with that information. I think that's since we started this practice group at Gable back in 2015. It was myself and another attorney who is now moved into another firm. But a lot of the discussions, and I know you've had these discussions as well. It's almost like explaining to someone how the show MacGyver works.
Right.
I can take this name, and I can take this password, and I can take this, and I can make a felony out of it.
Right.
And so again, it's that the value of those individual components is really hard to assign.
Yeah.
It's when you put them together and what they can mean. And so I think you're right. I think that we are seeing that, and I think really where we're seeing it is in the passage of more and more privacy statutes limiting the information that can get out in the first place.
Yes.
It's a lot like, again, just going back years even farther this time than 2003, but years ago, there's a movie called War Games with Matthew Broderick and Ali Sheedy, and there's a famous line from that movie about nuclear deterrence, and the computer that is running through all the scenarios ultimately says the only winning move is not to play. And that's what I've told my students in the master's course at TU I taught a couple of years ago, when asking them about what do they think the best way to protect information is, and especially walking through the various requirements and protections for information, none of which are universal. They're very piecemeal, as you know. It's either based on the type of information or where you live or what the source of the information is. And the best way to protect that, I think more and more people are seeing, is to not let it get into a position to be acquired in the first place. And that's where we're seeing these privacy laws come up, requiring in many instances some pretty specific authorizations, and at least with one proposed state statute that has not been adopted yet, actually requiring an opt-in from the get-go, not opting out.
Right. Which is becoming more problem, or more common out there, is that whole you have to opt into it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what you just said actually kind of links to the question we got in the comments. So I encourage everyone to throw your questions in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. But the question from one of our LinkedIn users is, what are some of the best practices around how organizations can better use consumer data and PII in employment cases, such as evaluating employment risk prior to hiring? And that's kind of an interesting take on it, because I do a lot of open source intelligence, researching people, trying to find out about them when I'm targeting an organization. So from that perspective, I'm going to try to keep talking, so give you a chance to get that, your throat cleared on that. No, what do you think about that? I mean, using that consumer data in employment cases, evaluating employment. So, I mean, there's two pieces of that. You either ask the employee a couple of different things for information and then make a decision off of that, or kind of what I get from the question is maybe you're using data that you can find on the internet and capturing that data or purchasing that data depending on where you're getting it, and then making a decisions off of that. Now, I would offer that can be really dangerous. Not only from a point of view of once you have data, you have to protect that data. So if you're gathering data from an organization or about a data subject, a person, once you have it, then you have to protect it. And as a CISO, I'm really cautious of that. If you're gathering data and capturing data, we have to implement encryption. We have to do multi-factor. We have to access control, all these different things. So if you are collecting data on a prospective employee, when they are not otherwise an agent of that organization yet, that might be problematic. I mean, what are your thoughts, Tom?
Well, the big caveat here is anytime you're talking about pulling in information from various sources to analyze a potential hire, the more information that you collect, the greater the opportunity is to use that to form, for lack of a better term, an illegal impression of a prospective employee, because then you run the risk of, and certainly not suggesting this is what the person asking the question is going to do, but I've seen where, because of some of the questions that are asked, there may be employment decisions made based on improper factors.
Right.
So that's the big caveat is, before you do anything like this, I would make sure and speak with spend some time and talk to either somebody in your if you've got in-house counsel in your company, great. If not, whatever employment lawyer that you work with, to make sure that you are following everything you need to do with respect to the particular employment laws that fall into this area. I think that just from a security and a privacy standpoint, I think the first thing I would start with is, what is it that you're collecting and why? And by why, I mean, why is that important to your perception of this person as an employee? Most businesses conduct background checks. That's not uncommon. Businesses that do that, though, there are particular requirements in the Fair Credit Reporting Act in terms of what you can request and why you request it and what you have to tell someone if that factors into your decision. Beyond that, there are, that's when it gets into, well, what is it that you're really asking about? Why is it that you're asking or collecting this particular information? Is it because, for example, that you are concerned that this person may be involved in illegal activity? Is it, for example, because you have seen this person's, or that someone has told you something about this person and you're trying to investigate it? Again, this is where your HR and your employment lawyer, either in-house or outside, can really help you and make sure that you're asking the right questions to begin with. The other piece from a security standpoint, and this is really splitting hairs, but understand what you may need for what purpose. And this came up specifically, for example, during COVID, when I know a number of my clients were asking employees about their vaccination status, because this was something that they were doing for health reasons. They were doing it to track their COVID risk in their offices. It was not something that was done for employment purposes. And as a result, that was information that really shouldn't be accessible by people making those employment decisions, like a manager, because they have no reason to know that. That forms no basis for their hire fire decision. So that's the other piece of it. It's not just make sure that you're collecting information for the right reason and not for an improper, illegal purpose. But then once you get it, make sure that only the people that should have access to it have access to it. And that
Yep.
includes, just going the next step. And Jonathan, I'd encourage you, I know you can provide some examples of this because we've talked about it, but understand how that information is accessed, both internally from an access level standpoint, but also internally from what we used to call soft access, from who is it that, is someone able to request that information and get it for
Right.
whatever reason. And as one example with respect to this, and then Jonathan, I'll turn it over to you, is I've gotten questions from clients before when some of their marketing departments want to use information to come up with a feel-good story. I mean, it's not something that's designed to go after a particular employee, but they'll ask, hey, can we get this information about COVID vaccinations, for example, to send something internally to say, hey, here's how we're doing, or here's why I got vaccinated. But make sure that you don't, that the reasons that are given don't somehow suggest to an employee that, hey, I better get vaccinated or I might lose my job.
Right. No, exactly. And I think that really becomes the crux of when we're talking about privacy. This idea of why are you gathering that information? What are you going to do with it? And then how are you going to store it? How are you going to monitor it? All these different things. And I think that from a security perspective, from a CISO perspective, I don't want to have to secure data that we're not supposed to have. That's one of those big things. So if we don't have a legal right to it, then we should not have it. Specifically because it would be illegal. But that's kind of a separate issue of my job is to protect the data. My job is to protect the systems. If I can have less data on less systems with less people having access to it, then that makes the security a little bit easier. Maybe not a lot easier because you still have to implement all the controls, but it's still a little bit easier. But yeah, no, this idea of what are you doing with the data, that is a huge one. And I oftentimes find people who I may ask them, why do you have this data? Why are you making these decisions? They say, well, because I always have. And I think that right there becomes one of the biggest problems in organizations is this mentality. They've always done something, so therefore they're going to continue doing that thing. When privacy laws are changing, and that is making it to be much more difficult to justify a legal right to that information. And I think that when I started doing this with you all those years ago, I knew the security pieces. I knew how to secure the data, but I was learning what data could we have and why can we have it. I mean, I remember going to an organization I was working with, and I asked them, why do you have this information? And they says, well, because we need it. We need to make decisions off of it. I said, well, do you make this decision with that? Well, of course not. That would be illegal. Do you make this decision with that? No, absolutely not. We would never do that. It's like, then you don't really need this information, because any decision you make off of this data is illegal. You shouldn't have it. So, I mean, I think that is something that you're right. If you have someone who is capturing information in your organization, they should absolutely be talking to your data stewards. So that would be your HR department, your general counsel, your external counsel, your financial office. Because even though we're talking about PII, sometimes it could also be financial information or intellectual property or a variety of other things that if you have access to data, there should be this mindset of how do I protect it? Should I have access to it? And what should I do with it? One of the things I really like doing, I know we're we're kind of on an extended tangent about this, but when I go to organizations here in the last year or so, one of my favorite things to do is I walk in, I go, okay, as it relates to data privacy security controls, some of the basic security controls that we talk about is number one, making sure only the right people have access to the information. Some basic controls like don't leave the information in sitting out on a desk somewhere. Don't let people take information home. Don't let them take it home and put it on their on their home computer. These are very basic controls. But when I ask organizations, it's like, do you have these? And it goes, no, we just haven't been able to implement them. We that's really hard to do. We can't do that. Then I usually bring up, I've got a roll of $10,000, with a rubber band on. And I go, okay, I bet you already have controls that deal with this sort of thing. Would you take this wad of money and leave it on a desk overnight? Well, of course not. Would you just let any random person in the organization have access to it? Well, of course not. Would you let someone take it home with them and put it on their home desk? Of course not. So if we look at those things from that perspective, a lot of organizations already have those controls in place. They're just not thinking about it from the same perspective of, if I do the same controls with data as I do with money, you're so far down the road on that. But you also, kind of thinking back to the misuse of it,
Mm-hmm.
if someone decides, hey, I'm going to take this money and go buy something for myself, or I'm going to go give it to someone in a pro, those are the same sorts of things that you got to think about from the data perspective. So if you've got access to data, you should, be very careful with it. What are you going to do with it? Who are you going to have access to? And those are just the basic controls of how do you manage that data within the organization.
Right. And to that end, I want to go back, and this kind of hooks back around to what we're talking about with respect to expectations, to get to some of the things we had actually planned on talking about today. Is this idea of value, because there, that hits on a couple of going back to that, hits on, I think, something that we talked about earlier, but then something that you just said, when we get to this idea of the value of information. Because as you and I have discussed before, information is often exchanged for something of value by the people that have it. Often, for example, you have I've had clients where they will get a reduced rate from a vendor because the vendor's allowed to keep a good amount of information from their systems that the client is using. And at first, the common response is, well, we're not using that anyway. Well, but understand what that is, what that may communicate to someone. Particular example I'm thinking of was a client where they were using a software, or as a computer purchasing software, and the vendor would have been able to retain their usage information from this software for a reduced rate. Well, because the way my client was using the software, which was to plan the expansion of their business, what that would have given this software vendor is some insight into how my client was expanding in this country, which, again, not something that I thought my client wanted to give away. And in talking to them, I said, well, no, we really do want to keep that. But it's making that connection between not just what value does this information have to somebody who wants to take it, versus what information does it have to me? What value do I see in it? Because
Right.
as you and I have talked about with respect to uh, doing training for employees on breach prevention, and a common comment is, well, it's just X, Y, and Z information. It doesn't really mean anything. Well, to you, maybe. But if you've got someone who is doing this 24/7 and is pulling in information from various sources, that may be the last puzzle piece that they need.
Yes.
And a broader question is, if you are willing to, if you go through this and you say, hey, well, this isn't really information that we need, so we can provide it to this vendor to get a reduced rate. Well, one of the questions then should be, if it's not this usage data that we were just talking about, if it's information that you had to begin with, why are you collecting it in the first place if it has no value for you?
Yep. Yes, that's the piece that always gets me is what are you doing with it? What the value is. The other thing that I like using is when we talk about privacy, what is the definition of privacy? The one I've been using here a lot in the last 2 years is privacy is the choice of how to use the information. If it's my data, I should be able to choose who I give it to and what they do with it, in terms of that process. And when the data subject does not have the choice, when the data gets sold by another controller or it gets sent to a third party and they have it, or a hacker gets it, that's when that loss of privacy comes in, because they don't have that choice anymore. And in some cases, well, some people may not mind, not having that choice.
Mm-hmm.
In some, there are times when someone's loss of privacy could lead to significant harm to themselves or their family, or worse, death. That's something that, we as IT security people and privacy people do think about is, what's the worst thing that could happen? Well, there have been people that died because of data breaches.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a major issue. And I don't want anybody to have to deal with that, either the fact that they're on the receiving end of that harm, or having to think about, I made a decision that led to the harms of these individuals because I let that data be breached, I let that get out, I collected it appropriate, whatever. But, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that's a good description of privacy, and I think that it dovetails in what I often say, which is privacy is the expected outcome of security. If you are appropriately
Yes.
securing information, then you are maintaining someone's privacy. But again, but then to, I think, adapt it to what you've just said, when you are securing someone's information, you are providing them the control as to how that information is shared, whether it's by
Yes.
verbal authorization or what else. And that is something I think we've seen over time. Change is the importance of that sharing in the minds of the general public, in that's how things get done.
Right.
Years ago, when I was in financial services, and one of my direct reports jobs was to go and collect hard copy privacy notices, or authorization of privacy practices from financial customers. And often they would have some pretty colorful language indicating that they didn't want their information shared. And sometimes we'd have to follow up with them and ask them, okay, I see that you've told us that you don't want your information shared. Yep, that's right. I don't want you to share my financial information with anybody. And so that's when we had to have conversations like, well, just to let you know then, your ATM card will probably not work next week.
Right.
Why? Well, because those aren't our ATMs. We share that information with with the ATM vendor. But if you're not wanting us to share your information with that vendor, then we can't give you an ATM card. We can't allow your ATM card to keep working. And so more and more we've seen this acceptance of this sharing as necessary for certain transactions, certain processes that customers have elected to have. But you still have the issue of from the company side. Let's go back to that issue of value. Privacy for the individual may be, I've chosen this service and therefore you can use my information for that. It's like my example earlier about buying something online. But from a larger scale standpoint, and this is where I think you've seen this in some of the enforcement actions that have come out under GDPR and others, and the reasons for some of these privacy statutes to come out that are very broad in their scope, is we're not talking about the individual privacy decision for one person's information. At a corporate level, we're often talking about how do we manage this asset that is customer data? What is it that when we collected the information that we told the customers we were going to do with their information?
Right.
And therefore, how can we use that to accomplish whatever purposes we are authorized to do by virtue of the fact that we've collected the information?
Right.
You know, I mean, if you think about it, it's not unlike, it's not unlike banking. If, again, to go back even farther, if you've ever watched the show, The Beverly Hillbillies, there's a particular episode where I think it's Granny goes into the bank and wants all of her money in a wheelbarrow. And Mr. Dreyfus is saying, well, I can't give you all the money because it's invested here and it's invested here. And because that when they opened the account, that was part of the allowance that they granted the bank was yes, the money is still mine, but you can use it for these purposes.
Right.
And that's where I think as a culture, where we need to start thinking about these sorts of authorizations that we're granting, because I think, you and I are aware of them because we live and work in this space. But when, more and more people that I talk to, and I'm sure you as well, they don't think about their information being used by an organization because they may not see the value in their information that the organization does.
Right. Yeah, no, they really don't. And, a lot of times if you actually read the terms of use, the agreements, the various things that you have, they'll tell you what they're going to do with information. You may not understand it just because of the way they've written it, but there's a lot of things that I'll read. It's like, I'm not going to use that. I'm not going to put my information in. So, that's something that I encourage people to always do is read it, read that agreement when it pops up and says, oh, you need to read this instead of just scrolling at the bottom and checking the box.
Mm-hmm.
You actually sit down and read it.
Yeah.
So
one last thing on the value piece before your question that I wanted to mention earlier is, we still see this idea of talking about the value of information and the value that how people are able to exchange their information for value now. Think about how many times you've been on a website and they say, hey, do you want 15% off your first purchase? Well, you go in and you put your email address and typically your cell phone number, so you sign it for text messages.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that is a very specific value proposition for them. But if you flip that around of what is that true value to the organization at that point, and where is that going to, spread out? I think that's another one of those questions that people don't often sit and think about. They think about that first 10% they get off,
mm-hmm.
but you've also given that information out. What's going to happen from that point forward?
Right.
So, okay. So I do want to, we've got, a handful of minutes left. We haven't gotten any hooks or anything. I see no warnings of time limits yet in the chat. So I do want to talk with you a little bit about, okay, to be fair to the audience, we warned everyone that once Tom and I start talking, we go back and forth because we really are passionate about this and we love these topics. But I wanted to talk with you. I wanted to ask you transparency and the conflicting requirements that some organizations have, because I think that's really, really important to think about nowadays, because this may not have been like this even just a few years ago. But think about with these conflicting regulations, these requirements of sharing information versus protecting that information and not sharing it. So tell me a little bit about what you're seeing now in the community, in the industries, where organizations are now being caught in the middle of they have to share something and they're supposed to protect something with that
mm-hmm.
conflict that's happening with that transparency.
Sure. And I'll preface this by saying these are, I will give very 60,000 foot summaries of particular issues. If anyone is interested in more detail, there's much more information out there. This is not intended to be any sort of specific legal recommendation or advice or anything like that. But one of the big things to happen that's going to kick in January of next year is the Corporate Transparency Act. And in a nutshell, it goes back to what we were talking before about the USA Patriot Act. It's essentially the act is a piece of legislation that was passed bipartisan that now has implementing regulations that have been promulgated, final form underneath it. And what those require is that starting January 1, 2024, companies that are formed that meet that meet very broad criteria. And again, without getting into a whole lot of specifics, because there are a number of specifics involved here that I don't want to try to delve into on this. But generally speaking, if you're forming an LLC, a corporation, any sort of entity that requires you filing something with the Secretary of State, starting January 1st, 2024, you've got 30 days to submit beneficial ownership with respect to that entity that's created. The idea being that the government has struggled with shell corporations and false front corporations that are hiding the beneficial ownership of the individuals that are actually involved. And if you go to the actual regulatory release of this that came out this year, or actually it was last year, September of last year, you can see FinCEN, which is a Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, who issued these regulations. You can see their motivation for doing so. They speak very bluntly about how this has been a problem. People have misused our financial system. It is much more efficient for us to ask the entities and the individuals who are actually forming these corporations and other entities to collect this information up front, rather than us having to go in and issue a subpoena for it later on. This impacts not just the entities that are being formed, but those individuals who are beneficial owners of the entities themselves. This also impacts law firms to the extent, for example, that Gable may be setting up some of these entities. There is a requirement for us to submit some information as well. And to your point, Jonathan, about transparency in this conflict here, we have a large scale piece of legislation and regulation that takes effect in January that is going to result in a great deal of movement of information from one party into a system of the federal government, which has yet to be created. And as opposed to, before, when we've talked about the principle of least access for HIPAA, for example, where it's only those people that need to know that information are going to have access to it. Here we're talking about a new requirement to take information, presumably that's stored securely, and put it into a governmental system.
Right.
And so there are a number of good reasons that the government has put forth in why they want this, but if you think about from, I'm putting my inside compliance hat on, just asking you to put your inside CISO hat on. Think about how information is collected and moves around inside an organization, and the difficulty that this could pose for some of these organizations who may not have an infrastructure to support this movement of information.
Yeah, and that's really scary to me on that part. I understand the intent of it. My concern is, I work with a lot of organizations that, we're still building security controls in, just trying to meet some of the requirements, the new requirements, or even older requirements of making sure that they're protecting that data. And now we're introducing a significant transfer of data to a third party. And then thinking about that process of transferring it and storing it on the other side, and the controls around it, and the kind of data that's going to be in it. So we've got about 30 seconds left. Tom, I really appreciate you coming out and and joining us. We could have talked, for another 2 hours on this stuff, and hopefully I can get you back out if you wouldn't mind, and we can
Oh yeah.
continue talking through this conversation. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you for the questions that came in the comments. You can absolutely find us on your favorite podcast and on the Voice America Network for Security for All. Kim should be back next week, so I really appreciate you guys letting me come in and have a little fun with some guests for the last couple of weeks. Again, thank you, Tom. It was a great topic. I hope everyone got something out of it. Please reach out on LinkedIn. If you guys have any questions, if you guys like the content, if you guys like the show, please let us know. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.